In the quiet Atlanta suburb of Roswell, Georgia, 41-year-old Lance Herndon is found murdered in his own home.
People were just stunned in a neighborhood like the one that he lived, that this kind of murder would take place.
And as investigators pour into the exclusive community, the secrets its gates have been hiding will be let out for all to see.
There was a lot of stuff going on below the surface.
It had everything. It had sex, money, betrayal, and murder.
10 miles northwest of Atlanta, the upscale bedroom community of Roswell, Georgia, is the kind of place where people aspire to live.
It's a place of comfortable affluence. It's a really pretty area, very quaint and removed from the bustle of Atlanta.
It's a shiny, suburban safe haven, far from threats of the city.
Roswell would best be described as a kind of modern-day Mayberry. You could leave your door unlocked, and you'd come home, and all of your furnishings would still be there.
By the summer of 1996, 41-year-old entrepreneur Lance Herndon has been calling Roswell home for the better part of 3 years.
Lance was very much a colleague. The remoteness, the privacy of Roswell. It was a place where he could relax and go beneath the radar.
Which division called Northcliffe makes the perfect retreat. Boasting a stunning view of the Chattahoochee River, the house also has plenty of garage space for his toys.
He had 4 or 5 cars, and he drove different ones for different reasons. He drove the Volvo for work, and then he drove the Porsche when he would go out.
The very recent divorcee joie de vivre makes Lance one of the stars of Atlanta's social scene.
He was almost like a Gatsby-esque figure. In Atlanta during that time, there probably wasn't a more eligible, prominent bachelor than Lance.
It certainly was not unusual for him to juggle 2, 3 women at the same time.
Adding to Lance's physical attractiveness is his acumen for business, which has made him a very rich man.
His expertise was in building computers that could interface with businesses, and he became a consultant with some fairly big-name clients.
The IT consultant runs his empire from an office setup in his basement, an arrangement that helps save time, a resource he efficiently micromanages.
He typically rose at 4 o'clock in the morning, but he was a pretty hard sleeper. And so what Lance did was he had 3 alarm clocks in his bedroom.
If the first one didn't wake him up, he'd have the second one ring. If that didn't wake him up, he'd have the third one ring.
By 8 o'clock every morning, Lance's day is completely mapped out on his personal calendar.
Good morning, Holly. Here's what I have for you today. Please call.
This includes creating a detailed work plan for each of his employees.
The only place I ever worked where my boss left a small tape recorder on my desk in a pile of papers, and it said, "Good morning," and then he would tell you all the things he wanted you to do that day.
See you at 8.
He was a creature of habit. Because of that, his employees, they knew exactly what to expect when they walked in the door every morning.
But on Monday, August 8th, 1996, recruiter Holly Stuber arrives at work only to find her boss's morning routine has been derailed.
He's very punctual, and I remember flying into the driveway. I ran downstairs to the office and literally burst through the door at 8 and was very surprised to find that he wasn't there.
Even more surprising is that Lance hasn't left his usual tape-recorded instructions or any other notes for Holly to work on.
That's strange.
And when she goes into his office to check his personal calendar, it's blank.
What the heck?
His computer screen was up and the calendar was empty of anything. I had never seen a blank calendar day in the 4.5 years that I worked for him.
A half hour later, when the office manager arrives, the two women try to call their boss.
Look, let's page him again.
Try one more time. Let's page him again.
assuming he's still in his living quarters upstairs.
We kept trying to page him. He didn't respond.
Oh my goodness, something is wrong.
And then they really started to panic.
The two women aren't sure what to do.
This is making me very nervous.
Lance carefully protects his privacy, and his employees aren't allowed in the residential portion of his house. Then, Lance's mother, who does the bookkeeping, walks through the office door.
Thank goodness you're here.
Listen, Lance is not responding to any of our pages.
The two employees urge her to check on Lance.
He doesn't feel well. I'll go up and check on him.
She went upstairs, and then the employees heard a real blood-curdling cry.
No! Emergency! Somebody done killed my baby. Tell me what's going on. I don't know. I came in the house, found him in the bed. Hurry, please.
It was very chilling. I was pretty much speechless trying to process it. Just oh my God, oh my God. I can't believe this is really happening.
When the Roswell police arrive, they find a gruesome scene in the master bedroom.
He was found in his bed, lying face up. His arms had been folded across his chest, as though he were being buried.
One look and it's clear. Lance Herndon has been bludgeoned to death.
He was struck at least 14 times with a hard object that crushed his skull in several places and fractured his face almost completely.
The room is covered in his blood, and from the arc of the spatter on the walls, investigators are able to determine that the killer sat on his chest and beat him to death. He probably never saw it coming.
There were no defensive wounds, so in all likelihood, either Lance did not expect it or he was asleep when the attack started.
While the crime scene is processed for trace evidence, investigators look for other clues in the room.
One of the things that they noticed is that he had a picture of a young woman, and that photograph was actually turned face down.
They also notice something odd about his alarm clocks.
These 3 alarm clocks that Lance kept around his room, they were all unplugged.
Trouble is, the clocks are digital, so there's no way to tell when they were disconnected. And the fact that Lance's body is laying on a heated waterbed further hampers the investigation.
The temperature of that waterbed would prevent a natural sort of rigor mortis from occurring.
And so, as a result of that, you could not really ascertain a time of death because his body temperature was preserved in an artificial state.
Investigators collect samples, sending specimens off to the lab for DNA testing. The results will take months to process. After searching the house and consulting Lance's mother, detectives determine the only things missing are personal mementos.
Lance had a signature ring that he wore on a daily basis. That was taken from the home, along with some other personal jewelry, like a necklace and also a bracelet. Nothing else was disturbed.
There are no signs of forced entry. And with nothing else taken, it doesn't appear that the murder is a result of a random robbery.
Everything about the crime scene upon its initial inspection told us that the person who was responsible for his murder had to be a person who knew his habits.
What's more, to the seasoned detectives, this case reeks of a crime of passion.
It was extremely violent and extremely bloody. There was a very high degree of rage involved.
Which has investigators wondering, who could hate Lance Herndon so much that it would bring out such a ferocious wrath? In August 1996, police are investigating the brutal slaying of millionaire divorcee Lance Herndon. As they question his neighbors in upscale Roswell, Georgia, residents of this gated community, seemingly protected from the evils of the world, can't help but be rattled by the police presence.
People were just stunned that in a city like Roswell and in a neighborhood like the one that he lived, that this kind of murder would take place.
Whereas before you probably felt perfectly safe in your community, now you got to question that.
And the public aren't the only ones troubled. Detectives find nothing in the way of leads, as a thorough search of the area comes up empty.
We searched the property surrounding the house. We sent divers into the Chattahoochee River.
Without eyewitnesses or a firm time of death, investigators have little to go on. Detectives begin piecing together a timeline of Lance's last known movements.
Who would have done this to him?
His distraught mother, who discovered his bloody body, tells them that her son had been at her house a little over 12 hours earlier.
He left my house at 8 o'clock last night.
She'd just seen him the evening prior. They had a birthday party for Lance's grandmother, in fact, at Lance's mother's home.
She doesn't know what her son had planned after he left.
Lance liked to have fun and be out and about.
His mother confirms that the turned-down picture in his bedroom is his main girlfriend, Lauren Petrus. She hadn't come to the birthday party with Lance, but even if she wasn't around, Lance didn't spend many nights sitting at home alone.
Lance loved to be out on the town. He loved to spend his money. He got a kick out of that.
The millionaire played as hard as he worked.
To the good life.
He had a lot of women in his life, and he spent a lot of money on these women.
Police don't consider Lance's mother a suspect. And as she leaves to make plans to bury her son, detectives have something to chase. They want to see exactly who Lance was bankrolling. The following day, investigators dig into the businessman's financial records and make a stunning discovery. Lance's high-flying life was about to come crashing down.
Lance was spiraling. His financial life was not what he portrayed it to be.
He owed a great deal of money to the IRS, and as the bank accounts were depleted, he was laden with debt.
Just about the only thing worth anything is Lance's life insurance policy, valued at just under $1 million. The beneficiary is his ex-wife, Rebecca.
Investigators wondered whether the insurance policy was incentive enough to have prompted her to murder her husband.
Rebecca is asked to come into the station for an interview. And when she arrives, she seems to be in shock, devastated by her ex-husband's murder.
I can't believe it.
She tells detectives that despite their recent divorce, Lance and she were still good friends.
Lance has always been good to me.
And when investigators ask her where she was the night of the murder,
I was with my friend, and I was there all night.
Rebecca says she was with her new beau.
She was dating by then, and she'd gone to her boyfriend's house where she had spent the evening.
And he can tell you.
The detectives were able to run that down, and the alibi seemed solid.
We were quickly able to eliminate her as a suspect.
What's more, Rebecca is eager to help investigators any way she can.
Lance had a little too much going on.
Seems Lance's finances weren't the only thing spinning out of control in his life. Her ex-husband was a philanderer. It was something Rebecca had finally had enough of.
There were always this sort of Lance carousing, and that started to wear on their marriage.
His wife found pictures of Lance with some other young lady, and that was kind of the end of that relationship.
His freewheeling behavior didn't end with his divorce. Lance began juggling even more women.
He had a side that was reckless. I would say, and impulsive.
Confident that Rebecca had nothing to do with her ex-husband's death, detectives move on. But they're left wondering if the handsome millionaire's recklessness may have cost him his life.
Lance had these women in his life that he managed to kind of keep separate from each other. But you know, that's it's very difficult to do.
Could a woman scorned have had it out for Lance Herndon?
And at some point, he can't keep juggling them. His world is crumbling. It's a house of cards.
In August 1996, within days of 41-year-old millionaire Lance Herndon's murder in his Roswell, Georgia home, investigators are learning that the high-rolling businessman had been living a double life.
I've described him before as kind of an iceberg. What you saw with Lance was just the tip. There was a lot of stuff going on below the surface.
If that's the case, it's not apparent a few days after his death at a huge public memorial held for him in nearby Atlanta.
Lance's death shook the community to a point in which even the mayor of Atlanta showed up and made remarks.
At a private funeral service the following day, close friends and family members gathered to say their goodbyes, including Lance's main girlfriend, 35-year-old beauty Lauren Petrus.
Lauren was kind of the belle of the ball. She was very attractive. So when he went out, if he needed some eye candy, Lauren was the one who went.
Lauren was the one that Lance would take home to meet his mom. She would be invited to family get-togethers.
Detectives wonder if Lauren has any idea about Lance's stable of other women. And if she did, was it enough to drive her to murder? Lauren agrees to come down to the police station for an interview.
So, where were you that night?
I had a date.
And when detectives ask Lauren for an alibi, she claims that she'd spent the night with another man.
And I was there all night.
Seems both Lauren and Lance were playing the same game.
She actually had another boyfriend and was sort of cheating on him.
Investigators are able to confirm that Lauren was with the other man all night. Lance had been murdered sometime between 8 p.m. when he left his mother's house and the time she found him the following morning.
So she's accounted for during the time in which we know that, that Lance was actually killed.
Not only has she a rock-solid alibi, she willingly sheds more light on Lance's movements that night.
I paged Lance around 9. And he called me back.
Investigators immediately subpoena Lance's phone records. And it turns out the call history shows that Lance was still alive at 9 p.m.
Story checks out. You're free to go.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Investigators release Lauren and immediately turn to a new lead they find in Lance's phone records. Around 11:30 p.m. on the night he was killed, Lance made another call, this time to another woman, Lacey Banks.
Lacey happened to be one of the women that Lance had cheated on his wife with. Part of what ended the marriage was his wife finding a nude picture of Lacey.
4 days after the murder, investigators ask Lacey to come into the station for questioning. And, suspiciously, the petite knockout arrives with her lawyer.
Brought my attorney. I felt this was the wisest thing to do.
When detectives ask about her relationship with Lance, Lacey claims that she's known him for close to 10 years.
He was a good friend, sometimes lovers. We dated back before Lance was Lance.
Lacey was from a small town in North Carolina, had moved to Atlanta and met Lance out socially, and they connected.
Although there were still occasional flings, they'd become more friends than lovers.
You're like my best friend, you know that?
She turned into Lance's hangout buddy and confidant, and so they were pretty tight.
He was very protective of her. giving Lacey part-time work in the evenings when she needed it.
Thank you. I can always count on you.
Lance would oftentimes have Lacey come by and do minor clerical administrative kinds of things in the office so that she could make some extra money.
When investigators ask her when she last saw Lance, Lacey drops a bombshell.
I saw him the night he was murdered.
She was actually at the house on the evening of Lance's murder.
Lacey had been working down in the office, putting together some invitations for an event that Lance had coming up.
She arrived around 6 p.m. while Lance is out to dinner at his mom's and lets herself into the basement office.
Hey, beautiful.
Lance shows up a few hours later. And after finishing up the work on the invitations, Lacey says goodbye, leaving around 10:30 p.m.
Thank you.
Shall we?
Yes.
Lance actually walked her outside, saw her to her car. They joked for a couple of minutes, and she got in her car, and she left. And the last time she saw him, he was heading back into the home.
When Lacey gets home around 11:30, she discovers that Lance has left a message on her machine asking her to call him back and let him know she'd made it safely home.
I'm home now.
She actually returned the call to him at his home, and he answered the phone.
Yes, I got home safely.
And that was the last time she had seen and heard from him.
Lacey's story matches up to what Lance's phone records already show. He called her around 11:30 p.m.
Bye.
But that doesn't prove anything. Investigators know that Lacey could have gone back to his house later that night. Then, Lacey drops another bomb. In their final conversations, she explains Lance told her he was determined to make some changes in his life.
He told me he had enough.
She's got intimate knowledge about the other girlfriends, and when one is involved in a number of relationships, at some point it might lead to problems.
Who are you talking about?
Lance seemed to be fatigued by his love life.
Do what you gotta do.
He confessed to Lacey that he was getting ready to clean house. And what she tells detectives next about Lance's plans will turn the investigation on its ear.
He was determined to get her out of his life, for good.
In the summer of 1996, while the people of Roswell, Georgia consume each and every rumor swirling around the murder of their friend and neighbor Lance Herndon, the police investigation enters its second week. This is when his sometimes lover, Lacey Banks, reveals to investigators she has important information about yet another woman in the victim's tangled love life.
He had enough.
She was able to provide us with some things that people ordinarily would not have been aware of because Lance confided in her and he told her things.
Do you know who he was talking about?
Lacey says Lance had had enough of girlfriend number 3, a woman named Dion Baugh.
Determined to get her out of his life, for good.
It seems Dion was becoming a little too possessive for Lance's comfort.
Why haven't you called me back? I just need
There were confrontations with Dion, trying to check in about where is he and what is he doing and who is he with.
Don't you dare hang up on me.
About a month before his murder, the drama in Lance and Dion's relationship hit a boiling point.
Dion had been trying to get a hold of Lance. He wasn't responding by phone. And at some point, she decided that she was going to drive over to his house.
Lance, open up.
And he didn't answer the door. So she looked up and she saw in the window this woman that was barely clad. And Dion flipped out.
It so happens Lauren Petrus, Lance's main girlfriend, was spending the evening with him.
You coward, get out of here
Dion
right
had started beating on the door, demanding to come in, and actually wanted to confront Lance about having this relationship.
Lance, you coward, come out right now.
Lance refused to answer the door. Lauren was inside saying, "Who is it?" And he's trying to explain what's going on and try to make some type of graceful exit to this situation.
So Lance plays dumb, and what he does next shocks Dion.
Can you please send a patrol over to my house?
He has Dion arrested for trespassing.
He just called the police and said, "There's a strange woman outside my door, and I don't know what she wants. She's going nuts, and can you come clear that up?" And Lance never, ever admitted that he knew her.
Dion is next on the detectives' list. But they're not ready to completely rule Lacey out. Detectives ask her for a DNA sample, and she agrees.
We need her to stay close, so don't go too far.
As they turn their attention to Dion, the case continues to capture the interest of the town. And now, making their way into the local press, are bits and pieces of Lance's very full love life.
Because of the circumstances, this rich divorcee being killed in his own home, it immediately became a huge story.
Some of the people that knew him didn't know that he had such a complex life. They only saw the side of him that he shared with them.
As Roswell reads and watches the news in fascination, 27-year-old Dion Baugh arrives at the police station for questioning.
I have a very busy schedule.
She tells investigators that she's a student studying business at a local college, and that she also works full-time as an executive secretary.
How long have you been in Atlanta?
About 10 years, on and off.
Dion was originally from Jamaica and had come to this country in order to further her career. She certainly wasn't someone who was comfortable just surviving. She wanted to thrive.
And thriving meant knowing the right people. So when 4 months earlier, Dion heard that Lance was throwing himself a 41st birthday party, she finagled an invitation to meet the very rich, eligible bachelor.
Dion was just his type, petite, super fashionable. She had this exotic kind of vibe to her that he really took to.
Let's just begin it.
Well, here's to the best.
It was one of those very electric meetings that took off like a rocket, with a very passionate, a very lustful, a very engaging relationship which developed over time.
As with his other lovers, Lance showers Dion with money and gifts.
For you, my love.
He actually provided her with a credit card. He would give her cash and bought her a car, the brand new Mercedes-Benz.
It doesn't seem like there's much of a motive for Dion to murder Lance.
Oh, my goodness.
But investigators still have Dion's trespassing arrest to consider. And Dion admits that she got upset when she found him at home with another woman. She thought they were exclusive.
From Dion's perspective, I mean, this is a man that she's involved with. They would spend time together. So this was not just a casual relationship. There was some substance to it.
She was even more furious he called the cops. But to her, it was merely a bump in their relationship. She says Lance worked his usual charm and swore to make it up to her.
Lance said he would take care of it.
Lance promised Dion that on her court date that he would show up and clear things up.
When asked where she was the night Lance was murdered, Dion says she was home, but admits to seeing Lance for a few minutes sometime between 9 and 10:30 p.m.
I can't really pinpoint the time.
He'd stopped by to drop off his laptop computer.
Yeah, he let me borrow it so I can do my homework.
Dion says that she'd only seen Lance for a few minutes that night.
So we got into a little petty argument, and then I made him leave.
Investigators dig deeper, asking Dion if she's seeing anyone else.
Oh, like a boyfriend would kind of be jealous of Lance?
I have a husband in Jamaica.
You what?
Dion was actually married to a young man named Jared, who was a pilot. He and Dion, although they lived in separate locations, were still, as far as he understood, happily married.
Really?
On hearing this, investigators find it odd that Dion would be so angry at Lance for being with another woman.
When was the last time this husband was in Atlanta?
What comes out of her mouth next stuns them.
It was during the week Lance got murdered.
In the hours before Lance was actually murdered, Jared was in Atlanta. He was actually at Dion's home. He had a flight scheduled back to Jamaica that evening.
Dion claims that she'd taken Jared to the airport that night around 8 p.m. and then went straight home. After Lance dropped off the computer, she was alone the rest of the night doing her schoolwork.
Does your husband know about Lance?
Jared has his suspicions.
In fact, Dion tells investigators that Jared and Lance had recently gotten into a heated argument.
Who is this?
Lance, who's this?
This is Jared, her
A
husband.
few nights before Lance was killed, he'd called Dion at home.
Jared is surprised by
I'm not putting her
the
on the
sound
phone.
of another man's voice on the other end.
What is going on between you
And
two?
he confronts Lance with, like, who are you and why are you calling my wife?
You need to come over here right now so we can settle this.
And there was a kind of a nasty exchange.
I'll be here waiting for you.
Lance even threatened to go over there and harm her husband in some way.
Is this a reason for detectives to start second-guessing their suspicions about Dion?
They have to ask themselves, maybe this wasn't one of the women who committed this brutal murder. Maybe this was a very jealous husband who couldn't contain his anger and went to stop the man who was stealing his wife.
We'd like to obtain a sample of your DNA. Is that going to be an issue?
That's no problem.
They tell Dion to stay close to home. Then, they turn their attention to her husband. A call to the airline quickly confirms Jared's alibi. Dion's husband got on his flight home to Jamaica at 8 p.m., which means he was long gone before Lance is murdered.
Ultimately, there was conclusive proof that he wasn't even in the country.
It is physically impossible for him to have actually been responsible for the murder.
That brings investigators full circle. And back to two of Lance's side girlfriends, Dion and Lacey.
Hey, how are you?
Both had a lot to lose financially by his death, but one of them is lying.
Oh.
Each woman claims to have been with Lance at the same time that night. 6 months after Lance Herndon was found murdered, DNA testing comes back from the lab. And in the results lie the identity of a killer.
What we simply had was a woman who felt that she had been betrayed.
Six months into millionaire Lance Herndon's murder investigation, police in Roswell, Georgia, finally have the test results from DNA swabs taken at the crime scene. The evidence retrieved from Lance's body reveals that he had sex with one of his girlfriends in the hours before his death.
Under his fingernails, they found the DNA that matched Dion Baugh and Dion Baugh alone.
Lacey Banks is released as a suspect, and detectives fully turn their focus to 27-year-old college student Dion Baugh. If Lance had only been at Dion's home long enough to drop off a computer, why is her DNA under his nails?
She's the #1 suspect. They don't have enough to proceed at that point, but that certainly puts her in the crosshairs.
We knew that it was a high-profile case, and so we wanted to be absolutely sure before we made the decision to move ahead with an indictment.
The final piece of the puzzle falls into place when a few months after Lance's murder, Jared and Dion go through an ugly divorce. And Jared's mother gives prosecutors new information about something Dion had shared with her.
The mother-in-law, ex-mother-in-law, alleged that at some point Dion had admitted that she went over to Lance's place that night.
The question is when. According to the timeline, Lance had been at his mother's house until 8 p.m.
You ready to get out of here?
Then at home with Lacey until 10:30 p.m. And she had spoken to Lance on the phone until around midnight. So Dion could only have been with Lance between then and 4 a.m., when his alarm clocks were set to go off.
She was the last person to see him alive.
Investigators believe they've found their killer. Now, they just need a motive. Taken at face value, it seems Dion would have nothing to gain by murdering Lance.
The gravy train was going to stop if he's dead. She's benefiting from him while he's alive. He's buying her stuff. She's got a car. She's got credit cards. She's enjoying a lifestyle that she wasn't enjoying before. She had every incentive not to kill him.
But detectives remember that Lacey told them Lance was ready to clean house.
He was determined to get her out of his life for good.
The reason why she would kill her sugar daddy is because the ride was over. He was cutting her off.
You coward, get out of here right now!
Her behavior in coming to his house and creating such a ruckus and embarrassing him in front of his company was just too much for him.
What's more, investigators check the court docket and discover that Dion's court date for the trespassing charge was scheduled for the morning after Lance was killed.
Don't you
That's when
dare
Dion's motive becomes crystal clear.
They figure that Lance told her that he was not going to go through with going before the judge and asking that all charges be dismissed.
Nearly a year and a half after Lance Herndon is killed, prosecutors are confident that they finally have enough evidence to convict.
She remained a suspect for a long time until these pieces of very persuasive circumstantial evidence got to a point where her guilt was undeniable.
On January 29, 1998, Dion Baugh is arrested and charged with the felony murder of Lance Herndon. His friends and family are thrilled.
I was glad to hear that they had found the killer. That meant that his family could move on with their life.
His family and friends could begin the process of closure and healing. They had been suffering for a very long time.
Lance's neighbors in the town of Roswell, who had begun to wonder if the murder would ever be solved, release a collective sigh of relief.
This was just not some kind of random thing that had occurred. It's an anomaly. Life could go back to the way it was.
The people that I would speak with, they were all happy to hear that, they'd found the person and that it was a personal relationship that put Lance in jeopardy.
At Dion's trial in April 2001, prosecutors lay out a timeline of the murder. In the early morning hours on the day Lance was killed, Dion shows up at his house.
I believe that Dion came to the home in an attempt to win him back.
Her intent was to induce him to rekindle the relationship.
Listen, we are done. It's over.
It didn't work out as she'd hoped. After they had sex, the theory goes, Lance told Dion that there was no going back.
There was an argument, and I believe that during that argument, he told her in no uncertain terms, that's it, we're through.
I want the car keys and the credit card back tomorrow.
No.
And I think that that trigger, her inability to save that relationship, to save that financial pipeline, was enough to send her over the edge.
We're not done!
But that wasn't enough to kill him. Not yet. Dion knew she needed Lance to help her with the trespassing charges in court the next day. So after he fell asleep, Dion slips downstairs to his office to check his calendar. Prosecutors argue that to her shock, the court date isn't in his schedule.
No.
Lance never intended to go to Dion Baugh's court hearing.
Dion snaps, and in a rage, she heads back upstairs, picking up something heavy on the way, and creeps towards a sleeping Lance.
She straddled him, just got on top of him, and began to just bash his head in.
She literally beats his brains out.
Then, worried that Lance's ringing alarm clocks might alert someone that something's wrong, Dion unplugs them. The cops have seen this before. Lance's murder is a classic crime of passion.
What we had was a woman who had provided companionship and sexual favors to a man, and he had rejected her. And in many of our cases, that is a simple formula for murder.
I think she thought that he deceived her, and it just brought out the worst in her.
On April 17, 2001, Dion Baugh is convicted of felony murder and sentenced to life in prison. She wins a new trial on appeal that ends in a hung jury. Rather than risk a third trial, in 2004, Dion pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter and is sentenced to 10 years in prison. For Lance's friends and family, it's the end of a long nightmare.
It was senseless, tragic. I think that he was robbed of the opportunity to perhaps be redeemed for some of the things that maybe he wasn't so proud of in his life.
Dion serves her time and is released from prison in July 2011. Though she pled guilty to lessen her sentence, she continues to maintain her innocence. In Roswell, people still talk about the frightening time when one of their own was murdered in his own bed.
People were satisfied that the person responsible had been brought to justice. But I think it was amplified because it was Roswell, where something like this just doesn't happen.
Any community can be a Roswell, and it can happen anytime. And typically, when it does happen, it's going to happen when you least suspect it, because you kind of expect the best from your neighbors.
On a freezing January night in 1976, a 16-year-old girl stepped out of a friend's house for what should have been a trip measured in minutes. She never came back. There was no scream that anyone remembered hearing, no dramatic chase through the snow, no witness who could point to a stranger, just a teenager walking into the darkness of suburban Illinois, and then nothing. By sunrise, the quiet had turned into horror. Road workers traveling along College Road near Lisle, Illinois, noticed something lying in the snow beside the roadway. At first glance, it looked like discarded clothing. As they drew closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. The body of 16-year-old Pamela Maurer had been left exposed to the winter cold. The crime scene was shocking. Investigators quickly determined that Pamela had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Everything pointed to an attack that had happened only a short time after she left her friend's home the previous evening. There were no signs that she had disappeared for hours. The timeline was brutally short. One ordinary decision, to walk a short distance for a soft drink, had ended her life within minutes. For the communities of Woodridge and Lisle, the murder shattered an assumption people rarely question until it disappears forever: that neighborhoods filled with families, schools, and quiet streets are somehow protected from unimaginable violence. Pamela was 16 years old. She attended Downers Grove South High School. Friends described an ordinary teenager with ordinary plans. Nothing about her suggested she had enemies. Nothing hinted that someone had been waiting. Yet somewhere between that friend's house and the destination she intended to reach, she crossed paths with a predator. That unknown figure would haunt investigators for decades. The first hours after the discovery became a race against time. Police secured the roadside. Photographs documented every footprint visible in the snow. Detectives searched nearby fields, drainage ditches, wooded areas, and roadsides, hoping the killer had left behind something, anything, that could identify him. Every fiber mattered. Every tire impression mattered. Every cigarette butt. Every strand of hair. Every tiny biological trace that science in 1976 could recover. Investigators interviewed friends, neighbors, classmates, and family members. Where had Pamela gone? Who had seen her last? Had anyone noticed an unfamiliar vehicle? Did someone remember headlights slowing along the street? Could someone have mistaken an abduction for an ordinary conversation? The questions multiplied much faster than the answers. The timeline itself created another problem. Pamela had left sometime between approximately 9:30 and 10 o'clock that evening after telling friends she was going to buy a soft drink nearby. Investigators concluded the attack occurred within a very short period after she left. Whoever killed her moved quickly, leaving detectives with only a narrow window to reconstruct. The absence of witnesses was almost as disturbing as the murder itself. In many homicide investigations, someone hears something. Someone notices an argument. Someone remembers a suspicious vehicle. Someone catches a glimpse that later becomes a breakthrough. Not this time. The streets had gone silent. Winter had emptied sidewalks. Darkness concealed movement. Whatever happened unfolded almost invisibly. As detectives expanded their search, they began examining whether Pamela knew her attacker or whether she had been selected at random. Both possibilities were terrifying. If she knew him, someone in the community might be hiding a secret. If she did not, then anyone walking alone that night might have become the victim. Parents stopped allowing teenagers to walk after dark. Neighborhood conversations changed overnight. Doors were locked earlier. Simple evening errands suddenly carried a different meaning. The fear spread faster than facts. Meanwhile, detectives worked every lead available. Names surfaced. Rumors circulated. People reported suspicious individuals. Each lead demanded interviews. Each interview demanded verification. Hours became days. Days became weeks. Still no arrest. The physical evidence recovered from Pamela's body remained critically important. Investigators carefully preserved biological evidence, understanding that although the forensic technology of the time had limits, future scientific advances might someday reveal what contemporary methods could not. That decision, to preserve evidence with extraordinary care, would become one of the most important choices made during the entire investigation. But in 1976, nobody knew that. Back then, detectives relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, physical comparisons, fingerprints, vehicle information, and painstaking detective work. DNA profiling did not yet exist as an investigative tool. Genetic genealogy was unimaginable. The case depended on traditional police methods, and traditional methods were failing. Months passed. Then years. The murder remained unsolved. Case files grew thicker. Evidence boxes accumulated. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited old questions. Every so often, someone would revisit the evidence hoping fresh eyes might recognize something overlooked decades earlier. Each review ended the same way. No suspect. No prosecution. No justice. Yet Pamela's file never disappeared. Unlike many forgotten investigations, this one continued to receive attention from dedicated investigators who believed that someday science might accomplish what interviews could not. That belief proved crucial. In 2001, long after the murder, advances in forensic science allowed biological evidence preserved from the original investigation to be analyzed for DNA. Detectives obtained a DNA profile believed to belong to the killer and entered it into CODIS, the national DNA database used by law enforcement across the United States. It seemed like the breakthrough everyone had waited for. A profile existed. Now all investigators needed was a match. Except no match ever came. Days became months. Months became years. Every time another convicted offender entered the database, detectives hoped the computer might finally produce the answer. Nothing. The profile sat silently inside CODIS. No alerts. No identification. No name. The killer remained invisible. Why? One possibility slowly emerged. Perhaps the person responsible had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA collection. Perhaps he had died before DNA databases even existed. Perhaps he had simply vanished from the criminal justice system entirely. Without another matching profile, the evidence could identify no one. The investigation reached another dead end. For many families, that would have been the end of a story. But Pamela Mora's family refused to let her be forgotten. Neither did the investigators. Cold cases possess a unique cruelty. Unlike active investigations, they rarely generate headlines. The flashing lights disappear. Reporters move on. New tragedies replace old ones. But for families, time never closes the wound. Every birthday becomes another reminder. Every holiday carries another empty chair. Every anniversary reopens questions no one can answer. Some detectives describe cold case work as conversations with the past. Evidence cannot speak. Witness memories fade. Documents yellow. Photographs deteriorate. The challenge becomes finding one overlooked detail capable of surviving decades. Pamela's investigation would eventually become exactly that kind of case. A conversation across generations. Between detectives who collected evidence in 1976, scientists who extracted DNA decades later, and investigators who refused to accept that an unidentified genetic profile was the end of a story. As forensic science advanced through the 21st century, a revolutionary idea began changing criminal investigations across America. Instead of waiting for a suspect's DNA to appear inside law enforcement databases, investigators could sometimes identify relatives through genetic genealogy, constructing family trees from distant DNA connections voluntarily uploaded to genealogy services. It was an approach that had already begun transforming cold case investigations nationwide. For Pamela's case, it represented something investigators had never possessed before. A new path. Not certainty. Not proof. But direction. In 2019, authorities submitted the preserved forensic evidence for advanced DNA testing and forensic genetic genealogy. Specialists developed additional DNA analysis, including a predictive composite of the unknown suspect's likely physical characteristics, before genealogical research pointed investigators toward one individual whose family connections aligned with the genetic evidence. That name had not emerged from a witness. Not from a confession. Not from an anonymous tip. It emerged from science. And once detectives began examining that individual, decades-old questions suddenly looked different. The forgotten murder of a 16-year-old girl was no longer simply an unsolved file collecting dust. For the first time in more than 4 decades, investigators believed they were no longer searching for a faceless stranger. They believed they were searching for the truth behind a single name. There was no arrest to make. No suspect waiting in an interrogation room. No warrant to serve before sunrise. The man investigators now believed had murdered 16-year-old Pamela Maurer had been dead for nearly 4 decades before his name ever surfaced in the investigation. That realization transformed the case overnight. The question was no longer whether detectives could stop a killer. It was whether they could finally prove that the unknown predator who vanished into the darkness on a January night in 1976 had, in fact, been Bruce Lindahl. For investigators, genetic genealogy had done only part of the job. It had pointed toward one family, one branch, one man. But a family tree is not evidence. It is a lead. Detectives still needed the same thing every homicide investigator seeks: a direct scientific connection between the crime scene and the suspect. That presented an extraordinary challenge. Bruce Lindahl had died in 1981. There would be no interview, no confession, no opportunity to compare a fresh DNA sample. If they wanted certainty, they would have to recover it from the only place left: his grave. The request was unlike anything many of the investigators had handled before. With legal authorization and the cooperation of multiple agencies, Lindahl's remains were exhumed in November 2019. Specialists collected biological samples, hoping decades underground had not destroyed the DNA needed for comparison. Even then, success was not guaranteed. Time is unforgiving. Moisture damages tissue. Heat changes chemistry. Every passing year makes forensic recovery more difficult. Laboratory scientists began an exacting process, extracting genetic material from the recovered remains while investigators waited for the answer that had eluded generations of detectives. The comparison was straightforward. One DNA profile had been preserved from Pamela Mora's body. The other came from Bruce Lindahl's remains. If the profiles matched, 44 years of uncertainty would finally begin to collapse into certainty. When the results arrived, they were decisive. The DNA recovered from Lindahl's remains matched the biological evidence preserved from Pamela Mora's murder. Prosecutors announced that the statistical probability of a random, unrelated individual matching the profile was approximately 1 in 1.8 quadrillion. The unidentified killer was unidentified no longer. For the first time since January 1976, investigators could attach a name to the crime. Bruce Everett Lindahl, 23 years old at the time of Pamela's murder. Living in Aurora, Illinois. Dead since 1981. The revelation answered one question. It immediately raised many more. Who exactly was Bruce Lindahl? Why had his name never surfaced during the original investigation? And perhaps most disturbing of all, had Pamela been his only victim? As detectives reconstructed his history, an unsettling pattern emerged. Lindahl had accumulated arrests over the years, but he had never been convicted of a felony that would have placed his DNA into modern criminal databases. That explained one of the investigation's greatest frustrations. When detectives uploaded the unknown DNA profile into Cody's in 2001, there was never going to be a match because Lindahl had died years before routine DNA collection became common. Suddenly, 2 decades of silence inside the database made perfect sense. The technology had worked. The suspect simply wasn't there. The more investigators examined Lindahl's background, the more troubling the picture became. He had moved through Chicago's western suburbs during the 1970s. He appeared ordinary. He held jobs. He socialized. To many people, he looked unremarkable. Yet investigators would later conclude that behind that ordinary appearance was a violent offender capable of targeting young women with calculated brutality. His own death, in April 1981, had already attracted police attention years before Pamela's case was solved. Authorities determined that Lindahl died after accidentally severing a major artery during the fatal stabbing of 18-year-old Charles Huber in Naperville. Instead of escaping, he bled to death at the scene. At the time, few could have imagined that the dead attacker lying beside his victim might also be connected to unsolved crimes stretching back years. Only decades later would DNA reveal that possibility. Investigators began reopening old files, missing person reports, sexual assault investigations, cold case homicides. They searched for similarities in geography, victimology, timelines, and forensic evidence. Not every case produced answers. Some lacked biological evidence. Others had deteriorated beyond the reach of modern science. But detectives believed Pamela's murder might represent only one chapter in a much larger story. The investigation expanded beyond a single homicide. Authorities publicly encouraged anyone with information about Lindahl, or possible encounters with him, to come forward. Detectives hoped forgotten memories from the 1970s might suddenly gain new significance now that a suspect had been identified. For Pamela Mora's family, however, the announcement carried emotions that defied simple description. Nothing could reverse 44 years. Nothing could restore a daughter whose life ended at 16. Nothing could produce a courtroom trial. Bruce Lindahl had died long before the evidence caught him. Justice, in the traditional sense, would never arrive. Yet there was something families of cold case victims often describe as almost equally important. Truth. For decades, Pamela's loved ones had lived beside uncertainty. Who did this? Why Pamela? Was the killer still alive? Those questions had shaped generations. Now, one of them finally had an answer. Investigators traveled to notify Pamela's surviving relatives before publicly announcing the identification, ensuring they learned the news privately rather than through television reports. The announcement also marked a milestone in forensic history. Officials described the investigation as the first homicide case in Illinois solved through investigative genetic genealogy, demonstrating how advances in DNA science could succeed where traditional investigative methods had failed. For detectives who had inherited boxes of aging reports and fading photographs, it was proof that no carefully preserved piece of evidence is ever truly obsolete. A single biological sample, protected through decades, could eventually speak louder than every rumor, every false lead, every dead end. Pamela Mora's case became an example studied by investigators across the country. Not because it was dramatic, not because it produced an arrest, but because persistence had outlasted time itself. Evidence collected in 1976, DNA profiling in 2001, genetic genealogy in 2019, a scientific confirmation in 2020. Each generation of technology completed work the previous one could not. Yet even as one mystery closed, another quietly opened. If Bruce Lindahl had escaped identification for so many years, how many other unsolved crimes might still carry his fingerprint? How many families were still waiting for the same phone call that finally came to Pamela Mora's relatives? Detectives understood that identifying one victim often illuminates others. Patterns emerge. Locations overlap. Witnesses remember details once dismissed as insignificant. Evidence once considered unrelated suddenly fits together. The work was far from finished. Pamela's case had become both an ending and a beginning. A murder solved, a broader investigation reborn. And somewhere inside storage rooms filled with forgotten evidence, investigators believed more answers might still be waiting, silent, invisible, preserved for decades, until science was finally ready to hear them. Part 3. The identification of Bruce Lindahl did not mark the end of the investigation. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a different one. For more than 4 decades, detectives had focused on a single question: who killed Pamela Maurer? By early 2020, they believed they finally had the answer, supported by DNA evidence and investigative genetic genealogy. But solving one homicide immediately forced investigators to confront another possibility. If the evidence connected Lindahl to Pamela's murder, could he also be responsible for other unsolved crimes from the same era? That question demanded caution. Investigators did not begin with assumptions. They began with records. Old police reports were retrieved from storage. Boxes that had remained untouched for years were opened once again. Case files from the late 1970s were compared side by side. Maps were spread across conference tables. Dates were aligned. Victim profiles were examined. Every confirmed movement of Bruce Lindahl during the years before his death was reconstructed as carefully as possible. The process was methodical rather than dramatic. Unlike television investigations, real cold case work often advances one document at a time. A single address, a forgotten employment record, a vehicle registration, an arrest report, a witness statement collected decades earlier. Each piece is examined not because it guarantees an answer, but because eliminating possibilities is just as important as discovering new ones. Authorities publicly acknowledged that Lindahl had been considered in connection with additional investigations, while emphasizing that every case required its own independent evidence. A suspect identified in one homicide does not automatically become responsible for others. Each allegation must be supported by forensic findings, witness testimony, or other corroborating evidence. That distinction mattered. Cold cases carry enormous emotional weight. Families who have waited decades deserve certainty, not speculation. For that reason, investigators repeatedly stressed that the identification of Lindahl and Pamela Mora's murder did not mean every unsolved crime from that period suddenly had a known offender. Science had answered one question. Science would have to answer the next. Among the most valuable tools available to investigators remained the evidence collected years earlier. During the 1970s, many detectives preserved biological material, even though contemporary laboratories lacked the technology to analyze it fully. That decision reflected experience. Investigators understood that scientific methods evolve. Evidence discarded today can never be tested tomorrow. Evidence preserved today may become decisive decades later. Pamela Mora's case became a powerful illustration of that principle. The biological evidence collected in 1976 had survived long enough for DNA profiling and later investigative genetic genealogy to transform an investigation that once appeared impossible to solve. For forensic professionals across the country, it reinforced a lesson that has become increasingly important. The value of evidence is not determined by today's technology. It is determined by tomorrow's possibilities. As news of the case spread, many people focused on another aspect of the investigation. It had taken more than 40 years. Some questioned why justice had required so much time. The answer lies in the history of forensic science itself. When Pamela Maurer was killed, DNA profiling did not exist. Investigators relied on fingerprints, blood typing, eyewitness accounts, physical comparisons, and conventional detective work. Those methods solved many crimes. Some, however, remained beyond their reach. The first major breakthrough in forensic DNA would not emerge until years later. National DNA databases would develop gradually. Investigative genetic genealogy, the technique that ultimately helped identify Lindahl, would not become available until decades after the crime. In other words, detectives in 1976 were not overlooking an obvious solution. The necessary scientific tools simply had not yet been invented. That perspective changes how many cold cases are viewed. An unsolved case is not always the result of investigative failure. Sometimes it reflects the limitations of the era in which the crime occurred. Technology catches up. Evidence waits. Eventually, the two meet. Pamela Mora's case became one of those rare investigations where patience, preservation, and scientific advancement intersected. For members of law enforcement who had inherited the file from retired investigators, the resolution represented something deeply personal. Many of the original detectives were no longer active. Some had retired years earlier. Others had passed away. The people announcing the identification in 2020 were standing on decades of work performed by countless investigators before them. Every interview conducted in 1976. Every photograph taken at the crime scene. Every laboratory submission. Every decision to preserve evidence. Each contributed to an outcome that none of them could have fully anticipated. Cold case investigations are often described as relay races rather than sprints. One generation carries the investigation as far as existing science allows. The next generation picks it up. Then another. Progress may be measured not in days or weeks, but in decades. Pamela Mora's investigation followed exactly that path. The case also highlighted the growing role of collaboration. Modern cold case investigations frequently involve local police departments, state forensic laboratories, prosecutors, DNA specialists, genealogists, and scientific researchers working together. No single discipline solves these cases alone. Traditional detective work identifies questions. Laboratories generate evidence. Genealogists reconstruct family relationships. Prosecutors evaluate legal standards. Each step depends upon the one before it. When even one piece is missing, progress can stop. When every piece aligns, a case once thought impossible may suddenly become solvable. The announcement identifying Lindahl also prompted renewed public interest in investigative genetic genealogy. The technique had already drawn national attention in several high-profile cases, demonstrating that carefully applied DNA analysis could identify suspects even when they had never submitted DNA directly to law enforcement. At the same time, investigators emphasize that these methods operate within legal frameworks and are subject to evolving policies designed to balance investigative needs with privacy considerations. The science itself continues to evolve. New analytical methods appear. Databases expand. Laboratory techniques become more sensitive. Samples once considered too small or too degraded may now produce usable results. For families of victims whose cases remain unsolved, those advances offer cautious optimism. Not certainty, not guarantees, but possibilities that did not exist 20 or 30 years ago. Pamela Mora's family experienced that reality firsthand. For decades, the file remained open. Questions remained unanswered. Then, through evidence preserved since 1976 and technology unavailable at the time of the crime, investigators reached a conclusion that had once seemed unattainable. Even after the public announcement, however, authorities remained careful in their language. The investigation into Pamela Mora's murder had identified the person they concluded was responsible. That did not erase the tragedy. It did not create the opportunity for a criminal trial. Because Bruce Lindahl died in 1981, there would never be a jury, courtroom testimony, or judicial verdict. Instead, the conclusion rested on the strength of the forensic evidence and the findings presented by investigators. For many observers, the case became a reminder that justice can take different forms. Sometimes justice is delivered in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives in the form of certainty after decades of uncertainty. Neither restores what was lost. But knowing the truth can close questions that have remained unanswered for generations. As the investigation continued to examine other possible links, authorities maintained the same standard they had applied from the beginning. Evidence first. Conclusion second. Every potential connection required independent verification. Every case deserved its own careful review. That discipline remains one of the defining characteristics of successful cold case work. Facts, not assumptions, determine the outcome. And in Pamela Mora's case, those facts emerged not from a dramatic confession or an unexpected witness, but from evidence that had remained silent for more than 40 years before science finally gave it a voice to see. By the time investigators announced that Bruce Lindahl had been identified through DNA evidence as the man responsible for Pamela Mora's murder, the case had already become something larger than a single criminal investigation. It had become a study in time, a reminder that some evidence does not lose its value simply because decades pass. Instead, it waits. The files documenting Pamela's murder reflected that passage of time in ways few people outside law enforcement ever see. Typewritten reports, handwritten notes, photographs carefully preserved in aging envelopes, evidence containers labeled years before personal computers became common in police departments. Each item represented a moment frozen in January 1976. Individually, they appeared ordinary. Together, they formed the foundation of an investigation that outlived the careers of many of the people who first worked it. Cold case detectives often inherit investigations they did not begin. Their understanding comes not from memory, but from records. Every interview must be reread, every photograph re-examined, every laboratory report reconsidered in light of modern science. That process requires discipline. It also requires humility. The goal is not to prove previous investigators wrong. The goal is to determine whether today's technology can reveal information that yesterday's technology could not. Pamela Mora's case illustrated exactly that principle. The original investigators collected and preserved biological evidence with care. Years later, advances in forensic DNA analysis transformed that preserved evidence into something capable of identifying a suspect. Still later, investigative genetic genealogy helped narrow the search further. Each scientific advance built upon work completed decades earlier. Without the careful preservation of evidence in 1976, none of the later breakthroughs would have been possible. Forensic specialists have often noted that evidence cannot create its own story. It must be interpreted within the context of verified facts. That is why every scientific result undergoes extensive review before investigators reach a public conclusion. A DNA match is powerful, but investigators still examine timelines, geographic information, known movements, historical records. The scientific findings must align with the broader investigation. In Pamela Mora's case, authorities concluded that those independent lines of evidence supported the identification of Bruce Lindahl as the offender. Even after that conclusion, many details about the crime itself remain unknowable. No one can reconstruct every minute of that January evening. No witness observed the entire encounter. Noken fischen exists. The exact sequence of events between the time Pamela left her friend's house and the moment she was attacked cannot be described with certainty. That distinction is important. True crime investigations frequently attract speculation. Real investigations depend upon evidence. Where evidence ends, responsible investigators stop. The absence of complete knowledge does not weaken the conclusions supported by forensic science. It simply defines the limits of what can honestly be known. Those limits are part of every homicide investigation, especially one separated from the crime by more than 40 years. As the case received renewed attention, it also prompted discussion among investigators throughout the United States about the growing importance of preserving evidence from unsolved crimes. Countless cold cases remain open. Some contain biological evidence collected before DNA profiling existed. Others contain fingerprints, fibers, photographs, or physical objects that may become more valuable as technology continues to improve. Pamela Mora's investigation demonstrated that evidence collected in one generation may become decisive in another. That lesson extends well beyond a single case. Police agencies across the country have expanded efforts to review unsolved homicides using modern forensic methods. Some investigations remain unsolved because evidence has deteriorated. Others because critical material was never recovered. Still others because available technology has not yet reached the point where meaningful analysis is possible. Each case presents different challenges. There is no single formula. Only persistence. The investigation into Pamela's murder also reflected another reality familiar to cold case detectives. Closure and justice are not identical. The identification of a suspect can answer long-standing questions. It can provide families with certainty. It can establish historical truth based on scientific evidence. But when a suspect has already died, the criminal justice process cannot proceed in the ordinary way. There will be no trial, no cross-examination, no sentencing. The investigation reaches its conclusion through the available evidence rather than through courtroom proceedings. For many families, however, certainty itself carries profound significance. Not because it erases grief. Nothing can. Instead, certainty ends decades of wondering. It removes the uncertainty that often becomes its own burden. Who was responsible? Was the person ever caught? Could it happen again? Questions that remain unanswered for years often become inseparable from the memory of the victim. Providing reliable answers changes that history. Pamela Mora's name had appeared in unsolved homicide files for decades. After the forensic identification announced in 2020, her case occupied a different place in investigative history. It became one of the most significant examples in Illinois of how modern DNA science can resolve a homicide long after conventional investigative avenues have been exhausted. That transformation did not happen overnight. It reflected decades of scientific progress. The development of DNA profiling, the creation of national DNA databases, advances in laboratory techniques capable of analyzing increasingly small biological samples, the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy as a specialized tool. Each innovation expanded the range of questions investigators could answer. Each opened possibilities that previous generations could scarcely imagine. Cases once considered permanently unsolved were revisited. Some remained unresolved. Others produced new evidence. A few, like Pamela Mora's, reached conclusions after decades of uncertainty. Even then, investigators continue to emphasize restraint. Scientific evidence answers specific questions. It should not be stretched beyond what it demonstrates. Responsible investigations distinguish between established fact and unanswered possibility. That distinction protects both victims and the integrity of the investigative process. The public announcement identifying Bruce Lindahl did not claim to explain every aspect of the crime. It identified the individual whom authorities concluded was responsible based on DNA evidence and the totality of the investigation. Beyond that point, the historical record remains limited by the available evidence. Forensic science has extraordinary capabilities. It also has clearly defined limits. Those limits are essential to maintaining confidence in criminal investigations. As interest in cold cases continues to grow, Pamela Mora's case remains a reminder of what careful evidence preservation and advancing science can accomplish together. The investigation began with traditional detective work in the winter of 1976. It concluded decades later through scientific methods unavailable to those first responders. Across that span of time, one principle remained unchanged. Facts endure. Evidence endures. And when both are preserved with care, even the quietest voices from the past may eventually be heard. For more than 40 years, the name Pamela Maurer remained attached to one of the most painful words in criminal investigations. Unsolved. A single word. 7 letters. But for a family waiting for answers, it represented decades of uncertainty. It represented birthdays that passed without her. Holidays where memories replaced conversations. Moments when relatives could only look back at photographs and wonder what life might have become if one terrible night in January 1976 had never happened. Cold cases are often measured in evidence files, laboratory reports, and investigative timelines. But behind every cold case is a person. A life interrupted. A family changed forever. Pamela was 16 years old when she was killed. She was at an age when the future still seemed endless. School. Friends. Plans. Dreams that had not yet taken shape. Her death transformed a normal suburban community into a place defined by fear and unanswered questions. For investigators who worked the case over the years, Pamela was never simply a file number. She was the reason the investigation remained open. The reason evidence was preserved. The reason detectives continued searching, even when decades passed without an arrest. That persistence became one of the defining elements of the case. Because time is usually considered the enemy of an investigation. Witness memories fade. People move away. Records disappear. Physical evidence becomes more difficult to analyze. But time can also create opportunities. Science changes. Technology advances. Methods that did not exist when a crime occurred can eventually reveal information hidden for decades. The Pamela Maurer investigation followed that unusual path. In 1976, investigators faced the limitations of their era. They had the crime scene. They had physical evidence. They had interviews. They had the determination to solve the case. But they did not have the tools that modern investigators consider essential. There was no nationwide DNA database. There was no genetic genealogy. There was no ability to compare unknown biological evidence against millions of genetic profiles. The investigation depended on traditional police work. Detectives followed leads. They questioned people connected to Pamela. They examined possible suspects. They searched for connections between the evidence and individuals known to investigators. But without a definitive identification, the case eventually entered the difficult world of cold case investigations. A place where files remain active, but answers become harder to find. For decades, Pamela's murder existed in that uncertain space. Not forgotten, not abandoned, but unresolved. Then came the era of DNA. The development of forensic DNA analysis changed criminal investigations around the world. Evidence once considered only a physical trace became a potential identifier. A biological sample could contain information capable of connecting a crime scene to a specific individual. For cold cases, this represented a revolution. Old evidence could suddenly become new evidence. In Pamela's case, biological material preserved from the original investigation became the foundation for future breakthroughs. The first major step came when investigators developed a DNA profile from evidence connected to the crime. That profile represented something detectives had never possessed before: a biological signature belonging to the unknown offender. But there was still a problem. A profile without a name is only a clue. Investigators needed a person. The DNA was entered into available law enforcement databases, including Cody's, with the hope that it would produce a match. But year after year, the result remained the same. No identification. No suspect. No arrest. The evidence existed. The answer did not. This is one of the most frustrating realities of cold case investigations. Sometimes detectives discover the key piece of evidence, but still cannot open the door. A fingerprint without a known comparison. A photograph without an identified person. A DNA profile without a database match. The investigation can move forward only when another piece of the puzzle appears. For Pamela's case, that missing piece came from a completely different field: genetic genealogy. The technique changed the way investigators approached unidentified suspects. Instead of searching only for a person's own DNA profile, investigators could examine genetic relationships. A distant relative. A shared ancestor. A connection hidden inside a family tree. The process required patience and expertise. Specialists analyzed genetic information and searched for relationships that could lead toward the unknown individual. It was not a simple database search. It was a complex reconstruction of family connections. Thousands of possible relationships could exist. Most would be irrelevant. The challenge was identifying the connection that mattered. Eventually, the research led investigators toward the Lindahl family line. The name Bruce Lindahl emerged as a person whose history required further examination. But even then, investigators needed more than a genetic connection. They needed confirmation. The importance of this step cannot be overstated. In homicide investigations, suspicion is not proof. A person may appear connected through genealogy, but investigators must establish whether that person truly matches the evidence. That is why authorities continued their work carefully. They examined records. They reviewed historical information. They compared available evidence. The investigation moved from possibility toward confirmation. Then came the decision to examine Lindahl's remains. Because Bruce Lindahl had died in 1981, traditional investigative methods were impossible. There would be no interview, no interrogation, no opportunity for investigators to observe his reaction to accusations. Only science could provide the answer. The exhumation of Lindahl's remains represented a remarkable moment in the history of the investigation. A case that began before DNA testing existed had now reached a point where DNA would determine its conclusion. The biological sample recovered from Lindahl was compared with the evidence connected to Pamela Mora's murder. The result confirmed the connection. After more than 4 decades, investigators announced that they had identified the man responsible. The unknown suspect who had remained hidden since 1976 finally had a name: Bruce Lindahl. For many people following the case, the announcement felt like the final chapter. But for investigators, cold cases rarely end so simply. Every answer creates new questions. If Lindahl was responsible for Pamela's murder, what else remained unknown? Were there other victims? Were there other cases where evidence had never been connected? Could additional investigations reveal more about a man whose crimes had remained hidden for so long? Those questions require the same patience that solved Pamela's case. No assumptions. No shortcuts. Only evidence. Authorities began reviewing available information about Lindahl's life and examining whether any other cases could potentially be connected. The process required caution because every unsolved crime represents another victim, another family, another search for truth. A connection must be proven. A theory is not enough. That principle guided investigators as they continued examining the past. The story of Pamela Maurer had begun as a tragedy in a quiet suburban community. It had continued as a decades-long search through unanswered questions. And it had eventually become an example of how science can transform investigations once thought impossible. But the most important part of the story was never the technology. Not the databases. Not the algorithms. Not the laboratory equipment. The center of the investigation remained the same person whose life was taken in 1976. Pamela Maurer. For 44 years, her name represented a question. After the breakthrough, it represented an answer. But for those who loved her, she was never a cold case. She was a daughter, a friend, a teenager whose life ended far too soon. And the investigation that carried her name forward became a reminder of a simple truth in criminal justice. Time may delay the discovery of the truth, but time does not erase the search for it. By the time authorities publicly identified Bruce Lindahl as Pamela Maurer's killer, the investigation had already become a landmark in the evolution of cold case investigations. It demonstrated not only what modern forensic science could accomplish, but also what careful evidence preservation could make possible decades after a crime occurred. The announcement marked the conclusion of one investigation, but it did not end the work of detectives. Law enforcement agencies continued reviewing Lindahl's history alongside other unsolved cases from the 1970s. Investigators examined timelines, geographic locations, known associations, and available forensic evidence to determine whether additional cases might be linked to him. As in any homicide investigation, each potential connection required its own independent evidence and could not be inferred solely from his identification in Pamela Maurer's murder. This methodical approach reflects one of the core principles of modern criminal investigation. Every homicide stands on its own evidence. Even when investigators suspect the same offender may be involved in multiple crimes, each case must be supported independently through forensic analysis, witness testimony, documentary records, or other corroborating information. That standard protects both the integrity of the investigation and the pursuit of justice. Forensic investigators also revisited archived evidence using technologies unavailable when the crimes originally occurred. During the 1970s, crime scene processing differed significantly from today's standards. DNA analysis did not exist. Many biological samples were collected because investigators believed they might someday become useful, even though laboratories lacked the ability to fully analyze them. In hindsight, those decisions proved invaluable. The Pamela Maurer investigation illustrates how evidence collected decades earlier can gain entirely new significance as science advances. DNA profiling, introduced years after the murder, provided investigators with a genetic profile of the unknown offender. Later developments in investigative genetic genealogy supplied an additional avenue for identifying that individual when conventional database searches produced no match. Together, these technologies transformed an investigation that had remained unresolved for more than 40 years. The case has since been cited by law enforcement professionals as an example of the importance of preserving physical evidence in unsolved homicides. Evidence that appears limited under one generation of technology may become decisive under the next. This lesson extends far beyond a single investigation. Across the United States, thousands of unsolved homicide cases remain open. Many involve evidence collected decades ago. Some contain biological material that has never been analyzed using modern techniques. Others contain fingerprints, fibers, photographs, or physical objects that may become more informative as forensic methods continue to improve. For cold case units, advances in science have fundamentally changed investigative strategy. Instead of relying exclusively on new witnesses or confessions, detectives increasingly revisit historical evidence with modern laboratory tools. Some reviews produce no new information. Others generate investigative leads. Occasionally, as in Pamela Mora's case, they fundamentally alter the course of an investigation. Investigative genetic genealogy has become one of the most significant developments in this field. Rather than searching only for an exact DNA match, specialists analyze genetic relationships that may indicate biological relatives of an unknown individual. By reconstructing family trees and comparing documentary records, investigators can narrow a large pool of possibilities to a much smaller number of individuals requiring further investigation. Importantly, genealogy itself does not establish criminal responsibility. It functions as an investigative lead. Any resulting suspect must still be confirmed through conventional forensic comparison and supporting evidence. In Pamela Mora's investigation, that final confirmation came through direct DNA comparison after Bruce Lindahl's remains were exhumed. Only after that scientific comparison did authorities publicly identify him as the offender. The investigation therefore combined traditional detective work, modern DNA analysis, and genealogical research into a single evidentiary framework. For families of homicide victims, cases like Pamela Mora's also illustrate the emotional complexity of delayed resolution. When an offender has died before being identified, the criminal justice process cannot proceed through trial. There is no opportunity for cross-examination, no jury deliberation, no sentencing hearing. Instead, the investigation concludes through the available forensic evidence and the findings presented by law enforcement. Although this differs from a criminal prosecution, official identification can still answer questions that have remained unresolved for decades. For investigators, these cases also reinforce the importance of institutional continuity. Cold case investigations often extend beyond individual careers. Detectives retire. Laboratory personnel change. Supervisors are replaced. What remains constant is the evidence itself. Comprehensive documentation allows future investigators to understand earlier decisions and apply new scientific methods without repeating prior work. Pamela Mora's case demonstrates how an investigation can continue across multiple generations of law enforcement professionals. The officers who collected evidence in January 1976 could not have anticipated the forensic technologies that would emerge decades later. Nevertheless, their careful documentation preserved opportunities for future investigators. That continuity proved essential. The case also reflects the increasing collaboration required in modern cold case investigations. Local police departments, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, forensic genetic genealogists, and scientific specialists each contributed expertise. No single discipline solved the case independently. Rather, the investigation progressed through the combined application of multiple investigative methods developed over several decades. This collaborative model has become increasingly common in complex cold case investigations throughout the United States. While Pamela Mora's murder has now been officially attributed to Bruce Lindahl through DNA evidence, investigators have continued evaluating whether additional unsolved cases warrant renewed forensic review. Such reviews remain evidence-driven. Authorities have consistently emphasized that every case must be assessed individually based upon its own facts and available forensic material. The broader significance of Pamela Mora's case therefore extends beyond the identification of one offender. It demonstrates how advances in forensic science can restore investigative momentum to cases once believed unsolvable. It also underscores the enduring value of preserving evidence, maintaining accurate records, and revisiting unresolved investigations as technology evolves. For the criminal justice community, The case serves as a reminder that scientific progress continually reshapes investigative possibilities. For families affected by violent crime, it offers cautious hope that unanswered questions may one day receive evidence-based answers, even after many years have passed. Pamela Mora's investigation ultimately stands as both a historical homicide investigation and a modern forensic milestone. It illustrates that while time may delay identification, carefully preserved evidence can continue to speak long after the crime itself, allowing investigators to reconstruct the truth through science rather than speculation. As Pamela Mora's case entered the historical record as a solved homicide, investigators and forensic professionals looked beyond the individual investigation to the broader lessons it offered. Cases like hers demonstrate how the practice of homicide investigation has evolved over the past half-century, not through a single breakthrough, but through decades of scientific, procedural, and technological progress. One of the most enduring lessons is the importance of preserving evidence. In 1976, investigators collected biological evidence using the best practices available at the time. Although they could not perform DNA profiling, they recognized that physical evidence might become valuable as forensic science advanced. That foresight proved decisive. More than 4 decades later, the same evidence formed the basis for DNA analysis and ultimately the identification of Bruce Lindahl. This principle now guides homicide investigations across the United States. Crime scene technicians are trained to preserve evidence even when its immediate value is uncertain. Advances in forensic biology, DNA sequencing, and laboratory techniques continue to increase the amount of information that can be recovered from increasingly small or degraded samples. For cold case investigators, every preserved item represents a future possibility. Another lesson concerns documentation. Investigations that span decades depend upon accurate records. Detectives who revisit a case years later rely on reports prepared by officers they may never have met. Crime scene diagrams, photographs, laboratory submissions, interview summaries, evidence logs. Each document contributes to the continuity of an investigation. Without comprehensive records, later investigators would be forced to reconstruct events from incomplete information, increasing the risk that valuable evidence could be overlooked. Pamela Mora's investigation benefited from decades of careful record-keeping, allowing successive generations of detectives to understand the original investigation and apply modern forensic methods without losing historical context. The case also illustrates the changing role of forensic science within criminal investigations. During the 1970s, biological evidence was limited primarily to blood typing and serological testing. These methods could exclude some suspects but rarely identify one individual with certainty. DNA profiling fundamentally changed that landscape. Later developments, including forensic genetic genealogy, expanded investigative capabilities even further. Today, investigators may combine traditional police work with advanced laboratory analysis, digital records, genealogical research, and historical documentation. Each discipline contributes different forms of evidence. No single technique replaces the others. Rather, modern investigations integrate multiple sources of information to reach evidence-based conclusions. Pamela Mora's case reflected that integrated approach. Traditional investigative work established the circumstances of the crime. DNA analysis identified the offender's biological profile. Investigative genetic genealogy narrowed the search. Direct DNA comparison confirmed the identification. Each stage depended upon the previous one. The investigation also highlights the importance of interagency cooperation. Cold case investigations frequently involve multiple organizations working together over extended periods. Local police departments maintain investigative responsibility. State forensic laboratories conduct scientific analysis. Specialized genealogists assist with family tree reconstruction. Prosecutors review legal standards governing investigative procedures. This collaborative framework has become increasingly common as forensic investigations grow more technically complex. Pamela Mora's case is often discussed within law enforcement training because it demonstrates how effective collaboration can overcome investigative obstacles that once appeared insurmountable. Another aspect receiving increased attention is the careful use of investigative genetic genealogy. Since its emergence as an investigative tool, agencies have developed policies governing when and how genealogy may be used. The objective is to balance investigative needs with privacy considerations while ensuring that scientific findings are confirmed through conventional forensic methods before any public identification occurs. Pamela Mora's investigation followed that sequence. Genealogy generated an investigative lead. DNA comparison provided confirmation. Authorities did not rely on genealogy alone to identify the offender. This distinction remains essential to maintaining confidence in forensic investigations. The case also underscores an important reality about cold cases. Not every investigation can be solved. Some cases lack biological evidence. Others involve evidence that has deteriorated beyond recovery. Witnesses may no longer be available. Records may have been lost. Scientific advances improve investigative opportunities, but they cannot overcome every limitation created by time. Consequently, investigators continue to evaluate each cold case individually, considering both available evidence and current forensic capabilities. Pamela Mora's case represents one successful application of modern science, but it does not imply that every historical investigation can reach the same outcome. For families affected by unsolved homicides, this distinction is significant. Scientific progress offers hope, but not certainty. Investigators cannot promise results. They can promise continued effort, careful evidence preservation, and the application of the best available forensic methods. Those principles guided the Pamela Maurer investigation from its reopening through its eventual resolution. Beyond its forensic significance, the case also serves as a reminder of the human impact of violent crime. Pamela Maurer was 16 years old. Her life ended before adulthood. Her family waited more than 4 decades for investigators to identify the person responsible. Although no criminal prosecution was possible because Bruce Lindahl died in 1981, the identification provided factual resolution based upon forensic evidence. For many families, establishing the historical truth represents an important component of closure, even when judicial proceedings are no longer possible. The investigation likewise demonstrates the persistence required in cold case work. Many of the individuals involved in the original investigation never witnessed its conclusion. Retirements, career changes, and the passage of time are inevitable in long-running investigations. Institutional continuity, through preserved evidence, documented procedures, and organized records, allows future investigators to continue where earlier generations left off. In Pamela Mora's case, that continuity ultimately proved essential. The evidence collected in 1976 remained available for analysis using technologies developed decades later. The investigation therefore became not only a homicide inquiry, but also a testament to the value of long-term evidence preservation and scientific advancement. Today, Pamela Mora's case is frequently referenced within discussions of forensic genealogy and cold case investigation. It illustrates how patience, documentation, and evolving science can work together to resolve questions that once appeared permanently unanswered. While no investigation can undo the harm caused by violent crime, the pursuit of factual, evidence-based answers remains one of the central responsibilities of modern criminal justice. Pamela Mora's investigation fulfilled that responsibility through a process grounded not in speculation, but in the careful application of science, documentation, and decades of persistent investigative work. The investigation into Pamela Mora's murder is now regarded as more than the resolution of a single homicide. Within the law enforcement community, it has become a case study illustrating how advances in forensic science can fundamentally change the trajectory of cold case investigations while reinforcing the enduring importance of evidence preservation. When Pamela was killed in January 1976, investigators worked within the technological limitations of that period. DNA profiling had not yet been developed for criminal investigations. Detectives relied upon witness interviews, crime scene reconstruction, physical evidence, and conventional forensic techniques available at the time. Despite those limitations, investigators made decisions that proved critical decades later. The biological evidence collected during the original investigation was preserved according to accepted forensic practices. Although its full value could not be realized in 1976, subsequent advances in DNA analysis transformed that evidence into the central component of the eventual identification. This progression reflects a broader pattern within forensic science. Scientific capability evolves. Evidence remains. As laboratory methods improve, previously inconclusive material may yield new information. Accordingly, many law enforcement agencies periodically review unsolved homicide cases to determine whether advances in forensic technology justify renewed analysis. Pamela Mora's investigation followed this model. After DNA profiling became available, investigators developed a genetic profile from evidence associated with the crime. When searches of law enforcement DNA databases did not identify a suspect, the investigation remained active while forensic technology continued to advance. Years later, investigative genetic genealogy provided an additional avenue for inquiry. Rather than searching solely for an exact DNA match, genealogical analysis examined biological relationships that could assist investigators in identifying potential relatives of the unknown individual. This process generated an investigative lead. Subsequent forensic comparison of DNA recovered from Bruce Lindahl's remains provided the direct scientific confirmation supporting the conclusion announced by investigators. The sequence of events demonstrates the layered nature of modern forensic investigations. Genealogy generated direction. DNA analysis established identity. Historical investigation provided context. Together, these elements form the evidentiary basis of the case. Importantly, investigators have consistently distinguished between evidence-supported conclusions and matters that remain unknown. Although Bruce Lindahl was identified through DNA evidence as Pamela Mora's killer, the precise circumstances surrounding every moment of a crime cannot be reconstructed with certainty. No eyewitness observed the entire sequence of events. Någon fistchen exists. Consequently, investigators limit their conclusions to facts supported by available evidence. This restraint reflects established investigative practice. Responsible homicide investigations avoid speculation where evidence is absent. The case also highlights the role of institutional persistence. Cold case investigations frequently continue across multiple generations of investigators. Personnel change. Leadership changes. Scientific capabilities evolve. What allows an investigation to continue is the preservation of evidence and documentation. In Pamela Mora's case, reports prepared in 1976 remained available to detectives working more than 40 years later. Crime scene photographs retained investigative value. Evidence inventories allowed laboratory personnel to locate materials suitable for modern testing. This continuity illustrates the importance of systematic evidence management within law enforcement. Another significant aspect of the investigation concerns interdisciplinary collaboration. Modern cold case investigations commonly involve local police departments, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, forensic genealogists, and specialized scientific consultants. Each discipline contributes distinct expertise. Detectives evaluate historical evidence. Laboratory scientists conduct DNA analysis. Genealogists reconstruct biological relationships. Prosecutors assess legal considerations associated with investigative procedures. The successful resolution of Pamela Mora's case reflects the coordinated application of these complementary disciplines. The investigation has also contributed to broader discussions regarding forensic genetic genealogy. As the technique has become more widely used, agencies have developed policies governing its application. Investigative genealogy functions as an investigative tool rather than a substitute for traditional forensic evidence. Potential identifications generated through genealogy require independent scientific confirmation before investigators reach official conclusions. Pamela Mora's investigation followed this evidentiary framework. The genealogical research narrowed the investigative focus. The DNA comparison established the forensic identification. This distinction remains fundamental to maintaining scientific reliability and public confidence. For families of homicide victims, cases such as Pamela Mora's demonstrate both the possibilities and limitations of modern forensic science. Advances in technology have increased the number of historical cases that can be revisited. However, not every investigation contains evidence capable of supporting renewed analysis. Some biological material has deteriorated beyond recovery. Some investigations lacked recoverable forensic evidence from the outset. Others involve circumstances where no currently available technology can produce additional information. Consequently, each cold case presents unique challenges. Investigators assess available evidence individually before determining whether renewed forensic examination is appropriate. Pamela Mora's investigation succeeded because preserved biological evidence remained suitable for advanced DNA analysis decades after the crime occurred. That combination of preserved evidence and scientific advancement cannot be assumed in every historical investigation. Nevertheless, the case continues to influence investigative practice. Law enforcement agencies increasingly emphasize evidence preservation, comprehensive documentation, and periodic review of unresolved homicide investigations. These practices improve the likelihood that future technological developments may contribute additional information. The Pamela Maurer investigation therefore occupies an important place in the continuing evolution of forensic science. It illustrates how careful investigative work performed in one era may enable scientific breakthroughs in another. The case further demonstrates that successful cold case investigations depend upon patience, rigorous documentation, interdisciplinary cooperation, and adherence to evidence-based investigative principles. Although the criminal prosecution of Bruce Lindahl was impossible because of his death in 1981, the investigation ultimately established an evidence-supported historical conclusion regarding Pamela Mora's murder. For the broader criminal justice community, the case stands as an example of how scientific innovation can complement, not replace, traditional investigative methods. Every advancement in forensic science builds upon evidence collected at the original crime scene. Without that foundation, later technologies cannot succeed. Pamela Mora's investigation serves as a lasting reminder that while time may complicate homicide investigations, carefully preserved evidence can continue to provide reliable answers long after the crime itself, allowing investigators to establish the historical truth through disciplined, evidence-based inquiry. For decades, the murder of Pamela Maurer represented a painful example of how a criminal case can remain unanswered despite the efforts of investigators. The investigation did not fail because authorities stopped searching. It remained unresolved because the evidence available at the time could not provide the final connection needed to identify the offender. That distinction became one of the most important lessons from the case. Cold cases are not always forgotten cases. Many remain active investigations waiting for circumstances to change. Sometimes that change comes from a new witness. Sometimes it comes from newly discovered evidence. And sometimes, as in Pamela Mora's case, it comes from technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. The transformation of forensic science over the past several decades has fundamentally changed the way investigators approach unsolved crimes. In 1976, detectives investigating Pamela's murder had to rely primarily on traditional methods. They interviewed people connected to the victim. They examined the crime scene. They collected physical evidence. They followed leads generated through investigative work. Those methods remain essential today. But modern forensic technology has added another dimension. Evidence can now reveal information that earlier investigators could never access. A biological sample, once considered only a small piece of physical evidence, can now contain a genetic signature capable of identifying an individual. This scientific evolution became the turning point in Pamela Mora's case. The evidence collected after her death remained preserved long enough for later generations of investigators to examine it using advanced methods. That preservation represented a connection between two different eras of criminal investigation. The first era began in the winter of 1976. Detectives worked without DNA databases or genetic genealogy. The second era began decades later, when forensic science provided tools that allowed investigators to revisit questions that had remained unanswered. The case demonstrates how homicide investigations often depend on cooperation between generations of professionals. The investigators who responded to the original crime scene could not know what technology would eventually become available. The scientists who later analyzed the evidence depended on the careful work completed decades earlier. The detectives who reopened the case relied on records created by people who had long since retired. Every stage was connected. Without the first step, the final breakthrough would not have been possible. The identification of Bruce Lindahl through DNA evidence also highlighted an important challenge in cold case investigations. A suspect may exist outside traditional law enforcement databases. When investigators first developed a DNA profile connected to Pamela Mora's murder, the profile did not immediately produce a match through available criminal DNA databases. This did not mean the evidence was incorrect. It meant the individual represented by that DNA profile was not present in the databases being searched. This situation is common in historical investigations. A person may never have been arrested for a qualifying offense. A person may have died before modern DNA collection systems were established. A person may have remained outside the reach of traditional investigative methods. For decades, that limitation prevented investigators from attaching a name to the biological evidence recovered from the case. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy created a new possibility. Instead of asking only, "Whose DNA is this?" investigators could ask a different question. Who is genetically connected to this DNA profile? That change in approach expanded the investigative landscape. By examining biological relationships, specialists could identify possible family connections and narrow the search. However, the process required careful verification. A genetic connection alone does not prove criminal responsibility. It provides a direction for investigators. The final determination must come from additional evidence. In Pamela Mora's case, authorities followed that process. Genetic genealogy helped identify a potential investigative path. The subsequent DNA comparison involving Bruce Lindahl provided the confirmation that allowed investigators to announce the identification. The case, therefore, became an example of how emerging technologies can complement traditional police work. It was not science replacing investigation. It was science strengthening investigation. The resolution also brought attention to another important issue in criminal justice: the passage of time. When a homicide remains unsolved for decades, many aspects of the investigation become increasingly difficult. Witnesses age. Memories change. Documents can be lost. Communities transform. People who once held information may no longer be available to speak with investigators. Yet evidence can sometimes preserve the truth, even when human memory cannot. That is one reason forensic preservation has become such a critical part of modern policing. The Pamela Mower case demonstrated that evidence collected decades earlier may still hold answers. It also demonstrated the importance of approaching cold cases with patience. Investigators cannot control when technology will advance. They cannot predict when a new method will become available. But they can preserve evidence, maintain accurate records, and ensure that future investigators have the opportunity to continue the search. For Pamela Mora's family, the identification of her killer represented an answer after decades of uncertainty. It did not change what happened. It did not restore the years that were lost. But it provided a conclusion to one of the most difficult questions surrounding the case. Who was responsible? That question had remained unanswered since 1976. More than 40 years later, investigators were able to provide an evidence-based answer. The significance of that achievement extended beyond one family. Across the United States, thousands of cold cases remain open. Many families continue waiting for information about loved ones whose cases have not been resolved. The story of Pamela Maurer demonstrates why those investigations continue. Because evidence can survive. Because science can evolve. Because a case that appears impossible today may become solvable tomorrow. The investigation that began with a teenager's death on a winter night eventually became part of a larger story about perseverance, technology, and the pursuit of truth. And while decades had passed, one principle remained unchanged. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every piece of evidence deserves to be preserved. And every unanswered question deserves the opportunity to one day receive an answer. The resolution of Pamela Maurer's murder did not arrive through a dramatic courtroom confession or a final confrontation between investigators and a suspect. It came quietly, through decades of preserved evidence, through advances in forensic science, through investigators who continued asking questions long after the original investigation had gone cold. That is often the reality of cold case investigations. The final breakthrough rarely happens the way people imagine. There is no single moment when every mystery disappears. Instead, a case moves forward one careful step at a time. A piece of evidence is re-examined. A new scientific method becomes available. A forgotten connection is discovered. And eventually, separate pieces of information begin forming a clearer picture of what happened. Pamela Maurer's case followed that path. For years, the investigation existed between two worlds. The first was the world of 1976, a time when detectives had to rely almost entirely on traditional investigative methods. The second was the world of modern forensic science, a time when biological evidence could reveal information that earlier generations of investigators could never access. The connection between those two worlds was the evidence collected during the original investigation. Without that evidence, later scientific advances would have had nothing to examine. This is one of the most important lessons from cold case investigations. Technology does not solve crimes by itself. Technology works because investigators first preserve the opportunity for discovery. Every photograph taken, every report written, every piece of evidence carefully stored, every investigative decision made decades earlier can influence what becomes possible in the future. The Pamela Maurer investigation became a powerful example of that principle. The case also demonstrated how the definition of justice can become complicated when decades separate a crime from its resolution. When Pamela was murdered in 1976, investigators could not identify her killer. When Bruce Lindahl was identified through DNA evidence more than 40 years later, he was already deceased. The criminal justice process that normally follows a homicide could not take place. There would be no trial, no jury, no sentencing. But investigators were still able to establish an evidence-supported conclusion about who was responsible. For Pamela's loved ones, the identification answered a question that had remained unanswered for decades. The uncertainty surrounding her death had finally been replaced with factual information. For investigators, the case represented the completion of a responsibility that had begun generations earlier. A homicide investigation is not measured only by how quickly it is solved. Some cases require time. Some require scientific progress. Some require future investigators to continue work that began long before they entered law enforcement. The Pamela Maurer investigation reflected all of those realities. It also highlighted the importance of caution in cold case investigations. When a suspect is identified, especially after many years, there is often public pressure to connect that person to other crimes. But investigators must separate possibility from proof. A criminal history, a geographic connection, or a pattern may create investigative interest. However, each individual case requires independent evidence. That standard protects the accuracy of investigations and respects the victims whose cases remain unresolved. In Pamela Mora's case, authorities focused on what could be scientifically established. The DNA evidence, the investigative process, the historical records, the available facts. The conclusion was based on evidence rather than speculation. This approach has become increasingly important as modern forensic tools receive greater public attention. DNA technology has transformed criminal investigations, but it must always operate within a careful investigative framework. A genetic result is powerful evidence, but investigators must still establish context. They must confirm identity. They must evaluate the circumstances. They must ensure that conclusions are supported by multiple sources of information. The Pamela Maurer case demonstrated that successful cold case investigations are rarely based on a single discovery. They are built through layers. Traditional detective work created the foundation. Forensic science added new information. Genealogical research provided investigative direction. Additional DNA testing confirmed the identification. Each stage strengthened the next. Beyond the science, the case also serves as a reminder of the human cost behind every investigation. Cold case files contain more than reports and evidence. They contain stories interrupted, families changed forever, communities that remember the moment when everything shifted. Pamela Maurer was 16 years old when her life ended. More than 4 decades later, her name remained at the center of an investigation that represented persistence across generations. The technology changed. The investigators changed. The methods changed. But the purpose remained the same: to determine the truth, to preserve the memory of the victim, to provide answers wherever possible. The case also contributed to a broader conversation about the future of forensic investigations. As technology continues to develop, more historical cases may receive renewed attention. Evidence once considered impossible to analyze may become useful. Investigations once considered inactive may return to the forefront. However, the process requires patience and responsibility. Not every cold case will be solved. Not every piece of evidence will produce an answer. But every carefully preserved investigation maintains the possibility of future discovery. Pamela Mora's case represents one of those possibilities becoming reality. A crime that remained unresolved for decades was eventually examined through the lens of modern science. A biological sample collected in the past became the key to identifying the person responsible. A question that had remained unanswered since 1976 finally received an evidence-based conclusion. The story of the investigation is ultimately not only about the passage of time. It is about what survives that passage. Evidence survives. Records survive. The search for truth survives. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the smallest remaining piece of information can become the detail that changes everything. For Pamela Maurer, that moment came after more than 40 years. A case once defined by uncertainty became defined by evidence. A name once unknown became identified. And an investigation that began in a small Illinois community became part of a larger history of how science can help uncover answers that time alone could not erase. For more than 40 years, the murder of Pamela Maurer remained a question without an answer. A case that began on a winter night in 1976 carried forward through decades of uncertainty, changing communities, evolving technology, and generations of investigators who refused to let the passage of time erase the search for the truth. The investigation began with a tragedy. A 16-year-old girl whose life ended far too soon. A family left with unanswered questions. A community forced to confront the reality that a violent crime had occurred in a place many people believed was safe. At the center of the investigation was always Pamela herself. Before she became the subject of a cold case file, before her name appeared in police records and forensic reports, She was a teenager with a future ahead of her. She was a daughter, a friend, a young person whose life should have continued beyond that January evening. That human reality remained the foundation of the investigation. The science, the reports, and the evidence existed for one purpose: to discover what happened to her. For decades, investigators carried that responsibility forward. Some worked the case in its earliest days. Others inherited it years later. Many never saw the final outcome. But each contributed to a process that continued across generations. The resolution of Pamela Mora's case demonstrated something fundamental about cold case investigations. Time does not always destroy the possibility of justice. Sometimes, time creates the opportunity for new answers. The detectives of 1976 could not have imagined the tools available decades later. They could not have predicted DNA databases. They could not have predicted genetic genealogy. They could not have predicted that evidence preserved from the original investigation would eventually provide the information necessary to identify the offender. But they preserved the evidence. And because they did, future investigators had a path forward. That path eventually led to Bruce Lindahl. Through investigative genetic genealogy and subsequent DNA confirmation, authorities identified Lindahl as the person responsible for Pamela Mora's murder. The identification represented the conclusion of a decades-long search. It also demonstrated the extraordinary evolution of forensic science. A crime investigated using the methods of the 1970s was ultimately resolved using technology that did not exist at the time. The case became an example of how modern science can revisit the past. But perhaps the most important lesson from Pamela Mora's investigation is not technological. It is persistence. Cold cases require patience. They require investigators willing to examine old evidence with new questions. They require agencies willing to maintain records and preserve physical evidence. They require scientists willing to analyze material collected decades earlier. And they require a commitment to the victims, whose stories remain unfinished. The conclusion of Pamela Mora's case also reflects the complicated reality of delayed justice. Because Bruce Lindahl died in 1981, there was never a criminal trial. There was no courtroom where evidence was presented to a jury. There was no opportunity for a sentence to be imposed. Instead, the resolution came through forensic evidence and the investigative findings announced by authorities. For some families, the absence of a trial may leave a different kind of pain. A final legal chapter that can never occur. But the identification of the person responsible still provides an answer to a question that had remained open for decades. The truth had finally been established through evidence. That achievement carries significance beyond one investigation. Across America, thousands of families continue waiting for answers in unsolved homicide cases. Many involve crimes committed before modern forensic technology existed. Many contain evidence collected during a different era of investigation. Pamela Mora's case offers a reminder that those investigations are not necessarily without hope. Scientific progress continues. Methods continue to improve. Evidence continues to be reevaluated. A case that appears impossible today may look very different tomorrow. The story also highlights why cold case investigations must be approached carefully. The goal is not simply to find a suspect. The goal is to establish the truth. That requires evidence. It requires verification. It requires investigators to distinguish between what is known and what remains uncertain. In Pamela Mora's case, authorities followed that principle. They relied on forensic confirmation. They relied on investigative findings. They relied on facts supported by evidence. The result was not a story created by speculation. It was a conclusion built through decades of investigation. The murder of Pamela Maurer began as a local tragedy. Over time, it became part of a larger story about forensic innovation and the changing nature of criminal investigations. It showed how evidence can outlast decades of silence. It showed how science can provide answers long after traditional methods reach their limits. And it showed why preserving the past remains essential for solving the future. More than 40 years after Pamela's death, investigators were finally able to provide what her family and community had waited so long to receive. An answer. Not one that could undo the loss. Not one that could restore the life taken in 1976. But an answer grounded in evidence. The final chapter of Pamela Mora's investigation is therefore not only about the person identified as responsible. It is about the endurance of a search that refused to disappear. It is about investigators who continued working, scientists who advanced the boundaries of what was possible, and evidence that remained silent until the world finally had the ability to understand it. A cold case is often described as a story frozen in time. But Pamela Mora's case reveals something different. A cold case is not always a story that has ended. Sometimes it is a story waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right technology, waiting for the right discovery, waiting for the evidence to finally speak. And after more than 4 decades of silence, the evidence surrounding Pamela Maurer finally did exactly that.